Finding a fair market value rental rate. That's one of the topics that business appraisers have to worry about in every project they work on. So before we get into that much, I do have to say there's a little bit more about me here on this slide. If you want to know more about me, pause now, and you can read that stuff. Otherwise, some businesses own their building directly. So there's an entity, a company that owns their machinery and equipment. Sometimes they also own the real estate. The building, the land that they operate out of is in the same entity, legal entity. That's one scenario. Some business owners have their business in one entity and their real property they own personally, but in a separate entity or personally. And then the company that's operating rents the real estate from this other entity. Some businesses operate out of a specific piece of real property that is designed for their specific use. That's an entirely different type of project. We're not going to be talking much about that today. Some businesses actually have a market lease in place with a third party already, which is perfect. It's exactly what we typically want to see. The other scenarios, however, make life more interesting. So, in order to determine the fair market value of a specific business, we have to be able to incorporate a market rental rate in our analysis, regardless of whether or not the owner is actually paying rent or not, either to themselves or not. So we do have to be careful about how we come up with that rental rate, what that market rental rate should be. Most of us don't have a real estate appraisal license. So we're going to have more about that later as well. When we're selecting rental rates, there are several options that business appraisers have been known to use. Some of the more commonly ones here are cited here. If you have a real estate appraisal of the subject property that your business that you're appraising is occupying, and that real estate appraisal report uses the income approach, you can look at that and cite the selected rental rate described in that report. Sometimes they're going to be a broker's opinion of value / rental rate. Oh, this property rents for about X. It's a real estate broker. Okay, fine. Sometimes you can refer to a third-party lease agreement. If they have a lease with a third party, and that's one of the documents you've asked for in your doc request list, and they give it to you, you can look there and see what the incremental increases might be, or the annual increases rather. Some folks I've seen doing business appraisal work will download industry data from BizMiner or RMA or whatever, and those sources will cite, here is an average rental rate paid by businesses in this industry. And they'll use that. That could be a problem. We'll talk about that in more detail later. Some business appraisers will do their own rental survey. They'll call up brokers and property owners and say, hey, let's find out what properties we're renting for. And the other one that I like to see, well, I don't like to see it, but I see it fairly often. And when I do see it, it makes me smile because there's so many problems with it. The appraiser simply makes up their own figure. That just looks right. Yeah, not a big fan of that. So of those methods, looking at a real estate appraisal with the income approach done is the most supportable method. However, keep in mind that USPAP, Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, in Standard 10.3b says this, right thing. But basically, if you're assigning your business appraisal report, you are responsible for the results by the other real estate appraiser. So if he screws up and you rely on that report in your report, you're responsible. So have that person fix it, and then therefore and so on. Yep, underlined it. Yay! That's the part you need to pay attention to. I suggest purchasing your own copy of USPAP so you can go through and read the standards so you know what it is that we're expected to do as business appraisers. Standard 9 and 10 are what you want to focus on. So using the industry average rental rate, a lot of folks will download BizMiner data and say, here's what the average rental rate for businesses operating in this industry. But they fail to realize that the industry average there encompasses anywhere from an itty bitty tiny baby business all the way up to the big, large, huge businesses. So think about, before you just use that average rate, how applicable is that average rate to the specific location that the business you're appraising occupies? What about the specific characteristics of the property in question? How about the specific demand for rental properties in that area? The location and in respect to various other like roads and other access points, and if sometimes it's important, train stations. most likely that average rate does not have anything to do with any of that stuff. So be careful. Yeah, also, are you qualified to apply on any of that? Here's a question to think about. You just look at the lease, right? If there is a lease in place, is it an arm's length lease? If so, okay, you should be fine. But if the rental rate identified in that lease rate, if that's really just, hey, you know, that's equal to the payments that are required to make payments on the loan that we use to buy the property, that may not be an appropriate rental rate for use to be equal to market value, right? Rental rate survey. Some business appraisers will do that. They'll contact lessors, property owners, and see what the market rental rate should be in an area. Pay attention though. This is what real estate appraisers rather, how they go about coming up with their rental rates that they use in their appraisals. So if we're doing the same thing that a real estate appraiser is doing, are we now appraising, or rather practicing real estate appraisal without having a real estate appraisal license? And is that a big deal? So real estate appraisers are like doctors, realtors, engineers, and folks like this who have state licensing boards. They're regulated by these state licensing boards, and they have to pass tests and pay fees and all kinds of other issues to deal with that. Business appraisers are not regulated by any government agency. We don't really have disciplinary boards, but these other places do. And if we're going to be practicing real estate appraisal without a license, they can come knocking, and that's not generally fun. So if you have a real estate appraisal site, not always, or rather, it's not always in there, the income approach. They don't always use that. Sometimes they'll just say, well, I've got the asset approach and I've got the market approach, and we'll conclude somewhere in there and be done, which does not help the business appraiser at all. So if the real estate appraiser did not use the income approach, did not come up with a market rental rate, does that mean that we don't have a rental rate that we can use? Well, not necessarily. So I had a real estate appraisal for a project I was working on, and they did not use the income approach. Instead, under their description of what the income approach incorporates in the real estate appraisal, they used this language. You can pause that to read it your own stuff if you like, but the highlight is, unless there were already strong leases in place. So basically the guy said, if it's already leased to a third party, okay, fine, a third party might buy it. But unless it's not, then why bother? And I'm not going to do it. So I am not above being petty enough to point out a typo in the real estate appraiser's definition there. That should have been this assignment, not the is. Anyway. Fortunately, the real estate appraiser did include a written description of how the direct capitalization analysis method works in a real estate appraisal. So I saw that description, I thought, you know what? I think I can back into what the rental rate should have been if the real estate appraiser had decided to make use of that method. So he gave the steps. Here they are. We're going to talk about each one of those in detail as we go through this little piece of the analysis. So also use this, this following technique at your own risk. I believe I did not practice real estate appraisal at all doing any of this stuff I'm going to talk about. Only data I used came directly from that real estate appraisal report or the investor survey from realtyrates.com. This is realtyrates.com is their website. Check it out if you want. You can buy their reports and do a subscription if you'd like. After we get through all of this stuff, I'd be curious to see if you have any feedback for me. But anyway, so where did I start? I looked at the real estate appraisal report because I needed to know what type of property I'm playing with. In the investor survey, it describes 32 different types of income generating properties. I need to know which one I needed to look at to come up with the market rental rate, or to have the real estate appraisal data help me figure out what the market rental rate should have been. So in the real estate appraisal report, under the zoning section, the real estate appraiser told me that the property was zoned as an industrial and manufacturing property. So I went to the investor survey, looked up the cap rates used by investors to purchase industrial properties. And per that fourth quarter survey, my effective date was December 31st. The survey said that those properties had been purchased with ranges of cap rates between 4.43% and a high of 12.66. Remember, the lower the cap rate, the higher the value. The average rate was 8.9%. That's going to be important in just a little bit. So remember the 8.9. So next, back into the real estate appraisal, look at the sales comparison method in the real estate appraisal report. In this method, the appraiser, he adjusts each comparable up or down to give it a more applicable or more appropriate comparable indication of value for the subject property. And based on the real estate appraiser and the analysis that the appraiser completed, they said the following: that in this particular instance, all the elements of comparison were bracketed well by the comparables. So that meant to me that the data that they used there, I could use to help me select what the cap rate should have been. So because the market approach data was so well bracketed, I'm going to show it to you here. Here was the comps, and 6 comps. That was the GBA. The average of all of those 6 comps was 137.87. The appraiser selected 136, even. So that means that the percentage of the average that Mr. Smith, I've changed his name to protect, you don't need to know what his name was. The percentage of the average is negative 1.4%. So the selected rate was just a tiny little bit smaller than what the average was. So since that 136 even is the selected, see, I'm not really positive what GBA stands for. I looked through the real estate appraisal report to find the definition. In that section that describes what GBA is, it's still only referred to as GBA. So I think it's gross building area, but I'm not positive. But because the selected rate was slightly lower than the average rate provided by the comps, I needed to tweak it. Highlighting that section for you. So to calculate it, I looked at the average cap rate from the investor survey. Remember that? It was 8.9%. So adjusting that 8.9 by the same percentage of average that the real estate appraiser used in his market approach, I dropped that 8.9 average cap rate by the 1.4% to come up with 8.78%. So now then I have that rate to help me calculate what the net operating income for the real property would be. So I multiplied by the conclusion of value the real estate appraiser came up with for the whole property, 985,000, by the cap rate of 8.78 times. That gives me a net operating income, NOI, of about 86.5. Right. So all these steps, I'm just backing into it. I'm going to apply this next slide here. I'm just backing from the very bottom all the way towards the top. I have the concluded value for the property because the appraiser gave me that. I'm backing to figure out what the rental rate would have been if the real estate appraiser had used that method. So my next step, I need to know what the vacancy and collection losses were in order to convert NOI to potential gross income, which is the actual rental rate that I need. So I have no idea what the vacancy rate is for wherever this property was located, and I have no idea how to look it up. So again, I went through the real estate appraisal and I found a chart that described industrial properties have vacancy rates of 5% in that area. So 5% is the premium I needed to add to my NOI, net operating income. So collection losses, I estimated as 0 because it's a 1-tenant building. That may or may not be appropriate, but I also didn't have any source for collection losses. So I'm just using the 5%. I'm not a real estate appraiser. So I went through and did some math. So 5% of 86.5 is 4,325. That's not the right number. I had to do the math I described here in the second paragraph. 1 divided by the quotient of 1 minus 5% to get the premium of 1.053 rounded. When I apply that to 86.5, I get the number 91,085. I tested it by subtracting 5% off of that 91,085, and I got 4,554. And I get really close to the 86.5 when I subtract the 4,554 from the 91,085. Therefore, the 91,085, it really is, or very close to, the market rental rate that the real estate appraiser could have used to arrive at a concluded value of 985,000 based on all the other stuff we just went through. So that's the rental rate that I used in my appraisal of the business to separate the real property from everything else that I was hired to appraise. So, in conclusion, yes, that is an overly complicated way to go about obtaining a market rental rate. I do not recommend it. However, it's there. I figured out how to do it, and that's why I've done at least one project so far. I do enjoy being called by the client early in on the process when they tell me, hey, we need to have this business appraised, and oh, by the way, there's this real property involved. And I can ask them to suggest or request of the real estate appraiser to make sure they use the income approach, because I'm going to need that market rental rate. So anyway, this was a fun story to share, and thought I'd make a video out of it. So any questions, comments, there's how you get a hold of me. I hope this video was useful and maybe a little bit entertaining as well. Have a good day.